Hello. I'm just sitting here reading my Bible, wearing my MATCA, and I just wanted to talk to you guys tonight about... Okay, just kidding. I wanted to talk to you guys about world religions. I was thinking about doing an ESL lesson because I used to teach ESL, but then I thought that's kind of lame, and you guys already speak English, so why? Besides, I'm much more interested in topics like history and religion and culture. Obviously, that's why I'm doing this program. And yeah, that said, I'm not going to be talking about Judaism or Christianity because I feel like we already probably know quite a bit about those, considering that everyone in this program is Christian and we trace our roots back to Judaism, so I don't see a huge point in talking about those. However, Islam, Buddhism, and Hinduism, those three, they are 3 out of the 4 biggest religions in the world in terms of numbers, and they are also by far the biggest, I don't know how to say it, that's where most of the unreached people groups are in the world, they're followers of one of those 3 religions, Islam, Buddhism, or Hinduism. So, with that in mind, I think it's important that we know about those others because, for one thing, as human beings, we need to know about our fellow man and know about the different things they believe and do. But more importantly, as Christians, we take Jesus' word seriously, and Jesus talks a lot about his last words to us were, go into all the earth, make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and Son and Holy Ghost. The Great Commission. So if we don't know what the people we're trying to reach believe and who they are, then we're not going to get very far. I also didn't really want to spend a lot of time talking about their origins and their core theology necessarily. Instead, I want to kind of focus on how they're practiced and lived in today's regular Buddhist, Hindu, and Muslim societies. And right now, I'm in northern India. This state that I'm in, Uttarakhand, is the just about the home of Hinduism. So this right here, a few nights ago, we went to this. You see that last word right there that says Haridwar? Haridwar is one of the holiest places in Hinduism. It's on the Ganges River, and every night after sundown there is a worship service called an arti that hundreds of thousands, literally, it's one of the largest gatherings on earth, and it happens every night. Hundreds of thousands of Hindus gather along the banks of the Ganges to worship the river. So what does that tell us about Hinduism? Hinduism is it's very much about reciprocity. It's got a lot of, with the gods, with the various manifestations of one god, depending on which Hindu you're talking to, whether it's one or whether it's many, whether it's, one god in many forms. The path they see to moksha, or to salvation, is you devote yourself to one god, you do things for that god, and then that god blesses you. And eventually, when you break free of these cycles of reincarnation, you pay off your karmic debt, then you don't have to keep going through the suffering of life, the death and reincarnation. How something like the Arti and Haridwar comes into play is some of that devotion. They show up, they worship the river, they take part in these acts of devotion at a lot of times like great expense to themselves, and then the gods bless them. The Ganges, the source of life. There's a lot of myths and legends about the Ganges and where it comes from and how important it is to Hinduism. The idea is that you then get blessed for showing that kind of devotion. The other thing with Hinduism is that it's that idea of reincarnation and that idea of karma go hand in hand, where what you do in a past life determines where you are now. Thus, if I'm blessed in this life, that's because I deserve it. If someone else is suffering, it's because they deserve it also. So the caste system goes hand in hand with that. The idea that there's a hierarchy in society, and there's not even a pretense of equality most of the time. Because if someone is suffering now and you help them, you're not really helping them. You're just making it take longer for them to pay off their karmic debt. So that does make it easier on more affluent people in this society, because then there's not as much of a burden to lift up the lower caste, lower class, suffering people, of which there are hundreds of thousands, or many. 41% of the world's extreme poor live in India. This devotion, this is not a Hindu item. This is, it's an icon from the Coptic Orthodox Church. I got that in Cairo, in the Coptic city, like a little while ago. And the Hindu version of those kind of things that you see here a lot is pictures of Ganesha, pictures of Shiva, pictures of Krishna, all the different Hindu gods. There'll be little shrines, or there'll be little pictures, or even like calendars, whatever, when you go into a shop or into a person's house. And that's kind of another example of those acts of devotion that Hindus show to their gods. I kind of need to move along now because we only have 10 minutes. I'm 7 minutes in, but Buddhism is, it came out of Hinduism, as probably most of us know. It's from India, but eventually it was kind of kicked out. Start with showing, I don't know if this shows it. Last night, the people that my wife and I were with here in Dehradun, they took us to this. This is a Tibetan Buddhist nunnery, and Tibetan Buddhism is it's one of 2 or 3 branches. There's Mahayana Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism, and then Tibetan Buddhism is sort of an offshot of Mahayana, but it's kind of a part of it, depending on who you ask. Anyways, how does this affect regular Buddhists? Half my wife's family is Buddhist. They're from Vietnam. And to them, the thing that seems most evident when you look in their life is they value conformity, and they value self-denial, and they value good manners, so to speak, where if you are suffering in this life, then you just need to learn to be content. Contentment is key, because as Gautama Buddha taught, suffering is a result of desire. So if you eliminate desire, if you no longer take pleasure in joyous things, if you no longer I'm blanking on the word. If you no longer allow like pain and suffering to negatively affect you, then you are on your way to nirvana. You're on your way to breaking free from the cycles of death and reincarnation. They share that element with Hinduism, but one thing I do see different from Hinduism and Buddhism is that while Hinduism, there's sort of a built-in justification for hierarchy, for looking down on others who are beneath you. Buddhism, there's still some of that, but it's less so. Like, they believe in taking care of the poor. That's more of a value than Hinduism. It's also something that is not great, though, either, in their, from what I've seen in their religion. Because that idea of karma and reincarnation, it still sort of has that effect of teaching people that they're better than others if they are better off in this life. One of my wife's aunts, she's a very devout Buddhist, and she takes her kids to orphanages and to like soup kitchens and things like that, not as a way of helping them, but she takes them there and says, see, aren't you glad that we're good Buddhists? Aren't you glad that, that we're not like them? It's almost a Pharisee kind of thing a little bit. So Buddhism, one other thing I wanted to mention about that before I move on to Islam, Buddhism, we almost think that with their kind of placid, tranquil, like happy facade that they carry with them, that it would be easier to reach Buddhists with the gospel, but there are a lot of elements mainly built into the idea of like honoring your ancestors, worshiping your ancestors, even that is especially there in Chinese Buddhism, that makes that very difficult. A girl I knew in Indonesia who was Chinese Indonesian, she was Buddhist, from a Buddhist family, but was basically like serving Jesus now. She was saying that she doesn't know how she would tell her parents that, and that in the Buddhist culture that it's very taboo to change your religion, because one of the examples she gave, every year there's a festival that Buddhists go to in order to pray for their parents who have died, pray for their ancestors who have died. So in order for you to benefit from that, your kids need to carry on the practices of Buddhism. If your kids don't stay Buddhist, then nobody's going to pray for you when you die. So it's not just a communal thing. It's not just like a collective culture thing on this earth with your peers or with your immediate family. It's also a collective thing through the generations, both deceased and future. I'm already over the time limit, but just briefly, Islam is I'm going to be careful how I say this, but Islam is the one that I'm the most familiar with, probably, and also the one that I have the most admiration for in a lot of ways. My experience living in an Islamic majority country for 2 years was that even though they were poor, even though income-wise, economic-wise, they weren't better off, really, than India, than Thailand, than plenty of other countries in this part of the world. I felt like the Islamic values that people are taught there from an early age resulted in someone like me, who's an obvious guest and foreigner, being treated like a guest, being treated with hospitality, rather than, India, I've said in different contexts, India is my favorite country in the world, but India is definitely a country where if you come as a foreigner, you're looked at mainly as a source of income, rather than as, at least as much so as a guest, as an equal, a peer, I don't know. In Indonesia, I felt like living in a Muslim neighborhood there, that people looked out for me. And that hospitality, that desire to get along and to welcome people, is something that I think is, from what I've seen at least, it's inherent in Islam, and I respect that. That sort of, to me, I see that as tying into a deeply ingrained sense of right and wrong in Islam. It's something that most Muslims you meet, they will have, they'll be friendly. It's easy to get them to warm up to you. They're wonderful, culture in a lot of ways. There's many different Islamic cultures. I'm not trying to generalize too much, but at the same time, there's also that really strong sense of right and wrong that both comes from and ties into their religion. And so things like saying anything bad about the Prophet, or saying anything bad about the Quran, or saying anything about MATCA, or anything that would dishonor any of like the sacred elements of their religion, is taken much more seriously than most religions. With Islam, I think the thing that, as I said, Hinduism, it's kind of reciprocity in a lot of ways. It's justice more than mercy. And Buddhism, very much about self-denial, contentment, also kind of justice over mercy. Islam, there is this idea within Islam that it is the final and perfect revelation, and that one way or another, everybody will accept that. Everybody will come to terms with the idea that Islam is the supreme ideology. So if that's through force, if that's through just an intellectual assent to it, however, they believe that there will be, eventually everybody's going to get it. Which I don't see as being too different from the way that Christians see the gospel. Obviously, I agree with Christians seeing the gospel that way, but it does make for a natural kind of a confrontation between the two religions. That said, most people in any religion, most regular people, just want to get along. They just want to enjoy life. So that element is there of wanting to reign supreme over the whole earth by whatever means necessary, but most people don't think it that deeply. There's a lot of stereotypes about Islam. There's a lot of things that people assume about Muslims, and I don't want to get too deeply into that, but like one final thought on that, on radicalism and the nature of Islam. To me, having spent time in Muslim cultures and read books from Muslim authors, from Christian authors about Islam, from all different perspectives, what I see is that Islam as an ideology and the effect of colonialism over the last few centuries kind of had a baking soda and vinegar effect. It's not like colonialism in parts of the world that were not Islamic so much resulted in a lot of like radicalized terrorism, and it's not like Islam in places that didn't experience colonialism so much went that way either. But like when you combine the two, when you take the deep sense of pride that their worldview, their ideology is bar none the best, and everyone will accept it, and eventually everyone will see that. And my computer's dying, so I'm just going to wrap this up. And then you take the humiliation caused by colonialism, and it's a bad combination.